Hey there guys! Today I am painting a recipe for some delicious fresh guacamole. So I always start these by doing a little preliminary sketch just to map out the composition, and then I transfer it to my paper. If you have watched my videos before, you'll know that I usually use Arch's cold press watercolor paper. It's my favorite. It has a little bit of a tooth and it takes the water and the color really, really well. It's especially good for like layering, which I do a lot of in these kind of pieces. So how I start, as per usual, is by putting down the first layer. And in the first layer, I try to get as much variation as possible because I don't like to go back and do too much. So it's definitely not just your typical light wash. I do try to get like a lot of shadows and lights in there as well. So I found painting the avocado, just getting the color right on the avocado, to be probably the most difficult part of this piece. Avocados have such like a nice milky, creamy color, and I found it really hard to replicate without getting oversaturated or watery. So I used a little bit of white gouache at this point, and I don't know, I feel like we kind of accomplished it, but not quite perfectly. Cilantro has been one of my very favorite elements to paint, and in the previous food illustration I did, I used the cilantro as like a floral element that bound the piece together, and I liked that so much that I used the cilantro the exact same way here. Again, I have real cilantro as a reference point, and I find that that really, really helps me. I don't precisely like follow each leaf, but it just kind of gives me the general idea of how it looks, and I kind of freeform it from there. So obviously when you're doing pieces like this, it's always a good idea to let things dry before you go in and do, say, the pit or the skin of the avocado. So that's why I did the cilantro in the middle of that. Just going ahead and adding the first shadow onto the bowl. The bowl gets a couple of different shadows. It's actually not a bowl, it's a molcajete made of volcanic stone, but I do like to make my piece look as good as possible as I'm going along. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I like the elements of my piece to look nice as I'm painting. When they don't, I guess it kind of makes me a little bit anxious, if you know what I mean. I do like to play around with gradients and colors and shadows and lights, and so here I just added a bit of blue to that green to get a little bit of shadow on the pepper, and tried to use a reference tomato and failed at that. This is a pretty colorful piece. In the composition study, I will explore color, so I'm not just kind of completely winging it. I'll make sure that everything is looking good and not too crazy, but generally I'm a pretty big fan of color, and so I usually don't limit my color palette all that much, even if I intend to. And even with the cilantro, I'll probably be using about 3 different greens here just to get a nice variation, so it's not all uniform. I think that's one of my favorite things about watercolor, is just like that variation in gradient that you can get. I thought I'd add some tri-colored tortilla chips because it was looking a little bit plain with just the guacamole ingredients, and of course chips are a key ingredient of guacamole. And that is some coarse pink sea salt, which will come to life a little bit later. So now we're adding the 3rd layer on the molcajete, and you can see it start to get some dimensionality here, which is nice. And then everything else in the piece is going to get a 2nd layer. And the 2nd layer really starts to add volume and detail. And I pretty much usually stop at 2 layers. I rarely do 3 unless it's something like a background or a sky or something. So the technique I'm using here is a wet on wet technique. I'll go ahead and put some clear water down, and then I'll just dab the color on, and it goes on nice and smoothly. And it's a great technique to use for shadows like that. And then with the onion, we're just adding that sort of, what would you call that? Sectional surface. Again, I try to get a lot of variation, so not all the sections are the same, and you can really kind of play with the shadows and achieve that volume here. And then the onion's getting one more little bit of shadow for some cohesion there. Like I said, the paper can take a lot, so don't hold back. And now we are adding some of the little details to the fruits and things that have texture. So just adding the little sections to the lime in different colors again to make it interesting. This is one of my favorite parts to do because I feel like this is where it really starts to come to life and you can be a little bit more loose. So doing the same thing with the chips, just adding some of that chippy texture. And then the final stage is going in. This is a charcoal pencil. And I'm using that because this is a volcanic stone, so it's very coarse, and I think that achieves that pretty well. And then I'm going in with the 4H or a 4B pencil and adding just a little bit more depth to the shadows. And then I almost always use a colored pencil to do the same with the colored elements of the piece. And you can see how that really does start to help in terms of adding some dimension to everything. And then giving the piece a little name, and of course signing it to finish. And that is another one done. I am absolutely loving doing these food illustrations. I find it really, really relaxing. It takes me about a day if I have a full day, or 2 if not. So it's pretty fast, and it's something that I want to continue. So it is available on Etsy, and I hope you guys enjoyed. I will talk to you again soon. TTFN.